So one of the things that I encountered a lot was this kind of crossing of purposes. You see in one after the next of these communities that the life of people with Down syndrome, for instance, is better than it's ever been. People with Down syndrome live longer, they have more intellectual accomplishment, they function better, the educational opportunities for them are hugely increased, and at the same time, it's becoming easier and easier to detect those pregnancies ahead of time, and more people are terminating them. Deaf culture has emerged in its most beautiful and vivid form at the exact same moment that the cochlear implant has been developed, which will effectively possibly wipe out that deaf culture by making deaf people effectively hearing. And so there's a constant tension between the social progress and the medical progress. My own view is that both of them should take place. Limb lengthening is an area in which it seemed to me that the medical progress was somehow still very barbaric. It's a procedure in which effectively you have someone who's a dwarf, you have a procedure in which the bone of the lower leg in both legs is broken in 10 or 12 places. As the bone begins to knit together, you have screws that are implanted through the leg and you turn them and the bone pulls apart again, and eventually you end up with longer limbs as a result of doing this lower leg, lower arm, upper arm. But it means years of being in terrible pain, frequently in a wheelchair. Many people suffer neurological damage. All that being said, I have met people who have had the procedure and who said, I hated being a little person, I hated having everyone stare at me, and now people don't stare at me anymore and I'm much happier. So I don't question the right of people to make that choice. What I do question is the possibility that parents, out of a kind of blind conformism, will push their children in that direction. That, I think, is problematical and dangerous. But we all strike a balance between what we accept in ourselves and in our children and what we seek to change.
I want to talk about families for a moment. You make the point that the parents in these situations have children not only that they didn't expect, but with whom they had no experience at all outside of their own ambit.
Right.
And yet you say that you found joy from these people, from the parents. They don't wish that the child was different or hadn't been born or was dead or something or other.
Right. I mean, I found a variety of experience, and I certainly wouldn't want to think that what I've written is a Hallmark card saying, you know, it's all so fantastic, what a shame if your children aren't disabled. That's not where I am. What I did find is that here, as in a way in looking at depression or even at the lives of Soviet artists, it's possible to look deep into difficulty and find meaning in it, and it's possible to grow from it. And I was interested in the way that people had grown. A lot of people said to me, I wouldn't exchange my child for another child, but I don't know about your children, but my children are quite flawed. They're wonderful, but they're quite flawed, and I wouldn't exchange them for other better children. I think all of us love one another with our flaws, or don't, but I mean insofar as one does. So I think the fact that these parents are attached to their children is not surprising. I think it's inherent to the situation. But that being said, I also think that a lot of people, recognizing that they don't have the choice to make their children get better, have decided instead to find strength and dynamism in it. There's the story in the book of one of the dwarfs who was the first person in his family to go to college because he had spent so much time in hospitals and read all these books, and who accomplished at a level that would have been unimaginable to his parents. You can have these great breakthroughs that are in some sense a function of the difficulty itself.
What about the siblings of these special children? How do they, is there a uniform kind of contact they have, or the way they appreciate or not appreciate them? How do they deal with it?
So for many years, the wisdom was if you have a severely disabled child, you should institutionalize that child in order to ensure that the siblings didn't have too much attention taken away. And then as the generation of siblings who grew up in those families came to maturity, the wisdom changed and said it's better for the siblings to keep the child at home, the disabled child at home, so that these siblings don't think that someone else was banished on their behalf, because it's a heavy burden of guilt. But the focus in both of these discussions is not on the disabled person, it's on the siblings and their mental health. My experience by and large is that At the micro level, I mean, there was one sister of someone with Down syndrome, and she said, there were many times when I wanted to go out and do something else and not be stuck at home taking care of Adam, she said, but there was never a moment when I wished he didn't exist or when I didn't love him and love having him as my brother. And that was what I found. At the micro level, it takes a lot of management, and it can be draining for siblings to deal with it, either because they're working on taking care of this person or because their parents are preoccupied with it. But by and large, the kind of the difficulty of that situation tends to make siblings, I think, more humane and kinder.
What about the question of advocacy? Who speaks for these people? Because in my experience, talking to parents, for example, they're tired. They don't cause a fuss, they don't picket, they don't go to the legislature or the state capitol and shout and wave signs. How important is advocacy, and who are the advocates?
Well, advocacy is enormously important throughout life, but particularly in dealing with any kind of minority, including the minorities addressed in this book. And some of the time, there are conditions in which the people who are affected are able directly to go out and seek advocacy. But as you say, it's draining and overwhelming, taking care of people who are very severely disabled in various ways, and a lot of the severe disabilities affect people to a point at which they themselves are not able effectively to go out and advocate. It's why I think it's important to establish this commonality of difference, because it seems to me that we can't really have gay rights if we don't also have disability rights. And we can't really have disability rights fully if we continue to have a destructive criminal justice system which ignores the possibility of rehabilitation. And I could go on with more and more specifics.
They're all interconnected.
The point is to say it's all one battle. And so instead of saying, okay, the parents of children who can't walk and can't talk should all get together and they should lobby in this particular way, what we should say is all of us who are addressing these questions, this huge body of people, should all be advocating together for a more just world.
I want to talk about the idea of that we as parents have, or think we have, the idea of the perfect child. And you deal quite extensively with the idea of genetic screening, how we're able to, through science, determine pre-birth any abnormalities or anomalies and so on, and quite often take extreme steps, abortion, to correct that. How dangerous is that, in your view?
You know, I think it's a very complicated question. I don't know that it's inherently completely dangerous, and I feel like there's often a tension between what you want for your own child. You want your own child to suffer as little as possible, and you want the world to contain, at least I want the world to contain, a lot of diversity. And I think that the diversity of human experience is what makes the world rich and is as important as the diversity of animals or the diversity of flora that we have. It can be a very difficult balance to strike. I don't think anyone should be obliged to have a child who will be more challenging than they feel up to dealing with. I think forcing people to have these children would be a recipe for disaster, for the parents, for the children, for everyone. And I think people should be able to make the choice whenever it is that they want to about whether they want to end a pregnancy. But I think a lot of the time the decisions are made from a standpoint of ignorance. And I say that as someone who would have made perhaps certain decisions before I started working on this book and wouldn't make them, or at least wouldn't make them so easily now. If you can understand what it really would be like to be the parent of this child, you might think about it differently.
There is a famous legal case in Canada involving a man named Robert Latimer, a farmer from the West who had a severely disabled daughter who lived in constant pain for 12 or 13 years of her life. And Mr. Latimer, who is now in prison, killed her. It had an extraordinary effect on not only the disability community, but the rest of us as to his motivation and the rightness or wrong. And no one doubted that he loved his daughter tremendously. When situations get that desperate, in families. What's to be done? I'm sure you don't condone manslaughter or murder, but can you see it going that far?
I think there are a lot of complicated questions and a little bit about the case. I think there were a lot of complicated questions there, and I don't know enough to judge it properly. But was the daughter really in that much pain? Was it the father's perception that she was in pain?
Yeah.
The danger is there's been an enormous amount, I studied it especially in relation to autism, of filicide, which has been described as altruistic, where parents have killed their child because the child is suffering and the parents can't bear to see it anymore. And the danger when that happens, and a lot of the parents who've done that have not in fact gone to jail for 10 years. In fact, many of them don't go to jail at all because everyone says, but it was really altruistic, they get suspended sentences and so on. There may be cases in which the suffering of a child was so extreme that that was appropriate, but it's awfully hard to know which cases they were. And as soon as you start saying, if you decide to kill your child and you say it was altruistic, you won't get in much trouble for it, you open the door to terrible abuses and to more people killing their children. So should we have a system in which a father who believes that his daughter is in so much pain that her life is without value can somehow make that argument before a court and can help her toward a sort of assisted death? Yes, possibly we should have a system like that. Should parents be taking it in their own hands to kill their own children? It's an indication of a social failure that he felt obliged to do that.
In the early teens of the 20th century, there was something called the social hygiene movement. It was started out to get rid of venereal disease and syphilis and all that, but it then moved into eugenics and sterilization and all kinds of things. Is there a danger we're entering into an era of a crusade for designer children?
Well, there's no question that people are already seeking designer children. As pre-implantation genetic diagnosis becomes more and more sophisticated, you can find out more and more about what your child is going to be like, and you can make more and more decisions about whether you want that child or that one. I think it's inevitable that science will progress to the point at which we'll be able to do that more and more. My hope is that social mores will also progress to the point at which people, when given more choice, won't all make the same choices. And so I think, again, it's the sort of tension between science and society. Michael Sandel has written a book called The Case Against Perfection, in which he argues very strongly that when you try to make everyone the same, what you end up with is disaster. And I think we all saw that, that experiment in Germany in the middle of the last century didn't turn out so well. Huge numbers of disabled people being eliminated. It didn't actually lower the rate of disability worldwide.
You say in the book that if you drive out the dragons, you drive out the heroes as well.
Yes. And I think that's to me a very important point, which is that it's not that suffering and difficulty automatically confers nobility. It does not by any means do so. But frequently it is an occasion which allows nobility to be realized. There was one of the parents who I talked to who said, I think it actually was helpful that we didn't believe in God and therefore knew that if we were to find a purpose in this, we were finding it rather than assuming that God had a purpose for us. And it was in that quest to find a meaning of our own, a meaning that was not based in religiosity, that we actually ended up falling in love with our own children.
You and your husband, John, your parents now.
We are.
How has parenthood informed not only your life, but your work in this, your thoughts in this area, being a parent? George, young George?
George is, yes, our youngest. So the structure of the family in the most condensed form is that my husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. I have a daughter with one of my close friends from college, and they live in Texas. And then John and I have a child who's with us all the time, of whom I'm the biological father. But our surrogate to carry that pregnancy was Laura, one of the lesbian mothers of John's biological children. So
it's a complicated entry into Facebook, isn't it?
Exactly, it is. People say to me, how many children do you have? And I have to say, it depends on how you count. But, our shorthand is 5 parents, 4 kids, 3 states. But it's turned out to be a very joyful set of arrangements. And people said to me, how can you possibly have decided to create a family while you were in the middle of writing this book about everything that can go wrong? They said, it must have terrified you. And I said, on the contrary, it's a book about how even when everything goes wrong, people find meaning in the experience of being parents. And I thought, okay, if all of these people could love all of these children, I'm going to love my kids, and it's going to be something I won't regret doing. So it enfranchised me and empowered me in that way. And I think the experience of having children and of feeling that intense vulnerability of having a child and not always being able to fix everything and make it all right, that was incredibly illuminating to me as I tried to empathize with the situations of the parents in the book.
You sound like a very, given the fact that you're still taking medicine for depression and all of the things that you've gone through, I would have to suggest that you're a lucky individual. Do you feel that? Blessed.
This is
even?
Wood, isn't it?
It is wood. Cheap wood, but it's wood.
I do feel lucky.
Graced? Do you feel
graced? I think I didn't feel. There were stages of my life when I didn't feel lucky. There were stages of my life when I felt cursed. I felt cursed at one stage by being gay and fought against it. I certainly felt cursed by the depression when it was at its worst. And somehow out of all of that darkness has come what is now quite a happy period of my life. And I'm a little superstitious about and I also think it's obnoxious to talk to large audiences about how happy you are, and life has its ups and downs, and the children can be infuriating, and I get, the flu and so on. But essentially, I do think so, and I think that I wouldn't have found this particular happiness without those difficulties. I might have found some other happiness, and it might have been an equal happiness, but not this happiness. And since this is my happiness, I'm very attached to it, and I'm therefore glad of the things that got me to it.
I think we are the beneficiaries of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrew Sullivan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What a pleasure.
It's now your turn. There's a microphone right here in the middle aisle. If you have any questions at all, please, if you can, make them brief so we can get as many questioners in as possible. And Andrew has graciously agreed to answer any and all questions.
As you point out,
yes, sir.
Optimistically, things change. I have a cousin who was born 40 years ago with Down syndrome, and she was the youngest of 12, and that certainly changed her life, but the doctors at the time said that she should be put into an institution. Her brothers and sisters and her parents said no and brought her home, and she's thrived as a result. What about the people today where those institutions really aren't available anymore, who find themselves in a situation where they don't want to parent these children and haven't been able to find a happiness through these situations? What about the social pressure on them now to not say no to their situations?
So I think there's been a disastrous shift. I think there was a period when the standard practice was to institutionalize children with any kind of disability. And I think we now have a situation in which the standard practice is to keep children at home. And I think actually both options should be available, openly and freely available to families to choose. There should be institutional settings which are as benign as such settings are capable of being, and there should also be the option of having the supports that are needed to take care of such a child at home. And I think there are some families who are well suited to dealing with a child who presents significant challenges, and there are some families who are barely holding on as it is and really can't do that. And I think trying to push everyone into either cookie-cutter mold has been very dangerous. And I think it's sad to feel that this shift, which is partly a matter of some social progress and of our more highly valuing people with disabilities, also has a lot to do with the economics of providing institutional care. It would be possible, at not unbelievably vast expense, to do much better on this front. And Canada, I must say, already does better on it than the United States does.